Welcome. This is a recorded webinar about memory cafes in Massachusetts that have worked to include both people with intellectual developmental disabilities who are living with dementia and members of the general public who are living with dementia and their care partners. This webinar was produced by the JF&CS Percolator Memory Cafe Network of Massachusetts. We thank the Massachusetts Councils on Aging and the Federal Administration for Community Living for supporting this project. The insights that you will hear about during this webinar come from the hard work and generous sharing of the 10 Memory Cafe coordinators whose names you see here. I would also like to thank Lainey Bruner-Canute at the Massachusetts Department of Developmental Services. My name is Beth Salzberg. I run the JF&CS Memory Cafe in Waltham, Massachusetts, and I am the founder and director of the Percolator Memory Cafe Network, which since 2014 has served as a resource for organizations in Massachusetts that are starting and sustaining memory cafes. Our cafe was the second one in Massachusetts, and now there are over 100, including cafes in 3 different languages. The Percolator is fortunate to be part of a growing national and global movement involving memory cafes and, more broadly, age and dementia-friendly communities. Here's what this webinar will cover. We'll talk about the context, IDD and the memory cafe model. What is IDD? What is a memory cafe? Why it makes sense to take on a focused effort to make cafes accessible to people living with IDD plus dementia. Second, the origins of IDD-Inclusive cafes in Massachusetts, how this project was started and implemented, and the specific populations it intends to serve. And then finally, and most importantly, what we've learned from these cafes, their challenges, their successes, and then we're going to boil down a lot of wisdom and guidance from the 10 cafe coordinators into the top 8 tips for success. So let's go ahead and start with context. For those who are not familiar, here is a definition of IDD. Intellectual and developmental disabilities, IDDs, are disorders that are usually present at birth and that affect physical, intellectual, and/or emotional development. Many of these conditions affect multiple body parts or systems. Some examples: Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, and autism spectrum disorders. So this category includes people with a very, very broad range of needs and abilities. Let's talk about why it would make sense to focus on including people with IDD in memory cafes. People with IDD are now living longer and aging into dementia in a way that did not happen in past decades. People with IDD have the same risk of developing dementia as the population at large, with 2 important exceptions. People with Down syndrome have about a 60% risk of developing Alzheimer's during their lifetime, and the average age of onset is 52 to 53 years old, so quite a bit younger than the general population. And people with traumatic brain injury have a much larger risk of developing dementia than the population at large, about 2.3 to 4.5 times the risk. Cafes should be accessible to everyone living with dementia in their community. That's a guiding principle. People with IDD represent about 3% of the global population, so a small minority. But these 2 groups of people, those with Down syndrome and those with TBI, have a much greater than average risk of developing dementia. So it's really important for any memory cafe to think about how they're serving this population. Now let's go over the basics of the memory cafe model. As we do, I'm going to show you photos from several different Massachusetts cafes. So what is a memory cafe? It's a social gathering for people living with dementia and for their family, friends, and professional caregivers. The main purpose is to reduce social isolation. We know that both individuals living with dementia and their care partners can become isolated. These are the key ingredients: a welcoming, homey, non-clinical atmosphere, a focus on social connection, So you do not usually see memory cafes hosting lectures about dementia, for example. They are designed for care partners and for people living with dementia. They're meant to benefit both. They are for people at any stage of dementia disease progression, and they are for people whose dementia is caused by any underlying condition. Cafes are tailored to local interests, languages, and needs. So each cafe is unique and reflects its community. And finally, no one is asked their diagnosis or if they have one. So cafes have an open door for people who have not been diagnosed, or simply people who will benefit the most if they can leave the disease at the door and focus on their strengths. Most memory cafes involve the creative arts. Creative arts provide a way to challenge and invigorate each person, no matter their cognitive abilities. There are no wrong answers. All the answers are right in the creative arena. And finally, I'm going to quote Dr. Mary Helen Imordino Yang from the University of Southern California. She says, "The entire purpose of the arts is to teach you to feel what it means to be human and to represent that to other people." I think that's a wonderful quote. The arts tend to tap into the emotional centers of the brain that are less affected by dementia, and they offer a way beyond words for people in the room to feel connected to one another, to really experience a sense of community. And again, that is the central purpose of memory cafes, to reduce social isolation. So they both provide an environment where people with a similar experience can meet and make new friends and connections, and they also offer the opportunity for that emotional experience of belonging. So there are two things about the memory cafe model that really paved the way for thinking about including people with IDD. And the first is that memory cafes strive to be inclusive. The first cafe, which was called an Alzheimer's cafe, was started in Holland in 1997, and from the start the goal was to widen the tent, to help people come together and feel less afraid of dementia. So cafes are all about inclusion. In the Percolator network, we often quote Mr. Rogers and ask, who are the people in your neighborhood? Well, those are the people who should be served by your cafe, and your cafe should reflect them. And second, cafes have an inclusive format. They serve people with a wide range of cognitive needs, varying from care partners to people with advanced dementia, due to a wide variety of underlying brain conditions that carry with them different symptoms. Now let's talk about how the IDD-Inclusive cafes in Massachusetts got started. The commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Developmental Services, Elin Howe, learned about memory cafes and thought they would be a great model for serving the growing number of individuals with IDD who are developing dementia, and bringing them together with the general population also living with dementia. So in 2015, she launched this experiment to provide funding and training to enable a group of memory cafes to include people with IDD plus dementia, along with the general cafe population. It's worth taking a moment to clarify whom these cafes were meant to serve. There was actually some confusion when the Inclusive Cafe initiative began as to whether these inclusive cafes were meant to serve any adult with IDD, regardless of whether this person was living with dementia. And there was some pushback about this from dementia advocates who said, dementia is not the same as IDD. These are groups of people who have lived very different lives, and we should not assume that just because their cognition is different from quote-unquote typical adults that they belong together in programs. However, the intent of this initiative was not to bring together any adult with IDD along with adults from the general population who live with dementia. The intent was to make sure that memory cafes are inclusive of all adults who live with dementia, and this includes a growing number of people who also have IDD. So here is a really simple back of the envelope visual to represent this. As I'd mentioned before, people with IDD comprise about 3% of the global population. So that's the yellow circle. And by the way, these circles are not to scale. I wanted them to be big enough that you could read the words in them. So 3% is not a huge group of people. However, there are people with IDD living in every community. And as we discussed, there are some groups of people with IDD who have a very high risk of dementia. So the green section here, where these two circles intersect, would represent people living with dementia. And this is who memory cafes are for. However, keep in mind that memory cafes are also for families and friends. For people with IDD who live in group settings in particular, the family and friends may well include individuals with IDD who do not have dementia. So yes, cafes are for people with dementia. However, because they are also for family and friends, you'll get a range of people attending, some of whom live with dementia and some of whom don't. And of course, because we don't ask people for their diagnosis, we don't always know whether someone has dementia or not, and that's by design. So I just want to go back to the core values of memory cafes. They developed as a non-medical program focused on reducing social isolation. The emphasis has always been on inclusion rather than precision in who is being served. And that's because the reality right now in our country is that there is a great deal of stigma and fear about dementia, and being diagnosed, being identified is sometimes a deterrent to participation. And we are mainly focused on helping people join in and connect and not excluding people. So here's a little background about the process by which the Massachusetts Department of Developmental Services began to support IDD-inclusive memory cafes. First, they provided training on how to start and run a cafe. And then in 2016, DDS, that's the Department of Developmental Services, received 31 proposals and chose 13 to fund with seed grants of up to $10,000 each. Most grantees were either IDD providers or aging services providers rather than collaborations of the two. Some were already running a cafe and were applying for funding in order to modify their cafe and include people with IDD, and some were just starting. The settings were extremely varied, as is always the case with memory cafes, so they included IDD multi-service providers, senior centers, a library, a restaurant, and an outdoor garden. So here's a snapshot of where we are today. These cafes have been running since 2016, so they are beginning their 4th year of operations. 9 out of 13 cafes are still running. DDS has provided additional funding of up to $4,000 per year to these cafes. And the Percolator network has been taking tips and insights from these cafes and encouraging other cafes in the network to invite and include people living with IDD. And now let's get to the part of the webinar you've probably been waiting for, which is what we have learned. The information that I'm going to share with you comes primarily from the following information sources. 8 of 9 DDS-supported cafe coordinators completed an online survey, very detailed survey, and several took part in follow-up phone conversations to explore their responses further. These are small numbers, so I'm not going to focus on the number of respondents to each question, but rather give you a picture of the themes that emerged most often based on a combination of the survey results and follow-up discussions. I'll give you the bottom line or the summary first. In general, IDD-inclusive cafes are working well. 9 continue to run, and coordinators feel that attendees truly benefit. Some of the cafes report that IDD inclusion is a natural fit. And finally, challenges related to provider silos are easing with time and clear communication. We're going to dig into each of these points more. So let's talk in greater detail about what's working. And by the way, the photos that you see are from IDD-inclusive cafes. So first of all, cafes are providing social and creative outlets for those who attend that otherwise would not be available in their community. Most guests are very accepting of one another. Music is something that came up a lot in the survey responses. It's something that Some of the cafes offer exclusively and some offer periodically, but it's something that seems to bring all the guests together. And finally, inclusive cafes may be helping to break down professional silos. 7 of 9 report that the cafes are helping providers to get to know one another, and 6 of 9 report that they are learning from one another about their client populations. So that said, what's still hard is those silos. DDS and aging services providers have different funding streams, different service locations, different referral networks, and staffing structures. Often they do not know each other. Professionals who work with older adults in the general population may not have had training or experience working with people with IDD. Usually, IDD providers do have training and experience working with people with dementia because they provide services for these folks throughout their lifetime. And again, we're in a demographic shift where there are more and more people with IDD who are aging into dementia. So those providers have generally had to gain this knowledge. So these ongoing challenges probably factor into why 4 of the cafes that originally received funding did not continue. It does take time to build these collaborative relationships and also referral networks. However, it is happening over time, and one theme you're going to hear again and again is that clear communication is essential. It's important that providers talk about what a memory cafe is for, the need for enough staff to attend with guests with IDD, and what everyone needs and is interested in. In addition to the professional silo issue, here are some challenges that emerged through the survey and the follow-up discussions. Individuals with IDD are more likely to rely on professional staff at a residence or day program to bring them rather than a family member. And some guests from IDD day programs or group homes lack a staff person to bring them. These programs are not staffed for one-on-one support, and there may just be 1 or 2 individuals within these settings who have dementia. So it may be hard to make a staff person available to bring one individual to a memory cafe. Second, the life experiences of guests with IDD differ from those without IDD. They're different life experiences, really different cultures. This does not have to be a barrier, but just something to consider and be aware of in planning activities and facilitating cafes. Next, family caregivers and professional caregivers have different needs. Family caregivers often attend with people from the general population living with dementia, and they may find it hard to find common ground with professional caregivers. Next, guests who attend the cafe as part of a group need help mingling with other groups. People with IDD are more likely to attend in groups. Really, anytime you have a group at a cafe, you have to be intentional about getting people to mingle. This is true for absolutely any group. At the cafe I run, I have volunteers from a local university, and I have to make sure that they spread themselves around the room and don't all stick together. A few guests from the general population show prejudice toward guests with IDD or simply question what the cafe is for. So I was really interested to see that this issue did not come up often in the responses of the cafe coordinators. I was actually really happy to see that this does not seem to be a major issue. However, it does happen occasionally that people from the general population react negatively to seeing people with IDD at the cafe. The older generations who are more likely to be coming to memory cafes did not grow up with mainstreamed classrooms, and they simply may not be used to being around people with IDD. And even if there's no particular prejudice, when people come to a cafe for the first time, they are looking around and asking themselves, do I belong here? It's often a challenge when you're living with a chronic progressive cognitive condition to go out and try something new, and memory cafes are still unfamiliar to the general public. So they come in the door, they want to know, is this the place for me? And if they see a group of people whom they identify as different from themselves in any way, whatever that may be, they may feel that this program is not for them. So again, this is just something for cafe coordinators to be aware of, be conscious of, and try to make that extra effort to show people you do belong and this cafe is for everyone. But this is the issue why some of the inclusive cafes have struggled a bit with maintaining a balance of guests. They have established strong connections with some residents for people with IDD who now attend regularly, and then they find they have a harder time attracting enough folks from the general population. So again, this is just something to be aware of and to work with. It is not something that should stop cafes from becoming inclusive of people with IDD, but just to be aware that this balance may be something to strive for. So now you've heard about what's working at most cafes and what some of the challenges are. And now I'm going to go through the top 8 tips from the survey respondents. I'm going to be including some wonderful quotes that I want you to see, but there's a lot of text on the slides that follow. So in between the tips, I'm going to show you some cafe photos just to give you a little bit of relief from all the text. So tip number 1 is do your outreach. Now this is something that all cafes need to do. Outreach and attendance is the hardest task for most cafes, and this is because we are trying to engage people who face many daily challenges and who may have become isolated. In our most recent Percolator survey about outreach and attendance, we learned that word of mouth is the #1 way that people in the general population find their way to a memory cafe, and that lack of familiarity with memory cafes is what cafe coordinators consider to be the biggest barrier to growing attendance. And as we discussed, aging services providers and IDD providers may be siloed and not know each other. So to get the word out beyond your own network, it's really important to build relationships with other providers. And this could be IDD case managers, group homes and day programs, senior center staff, just depending on where you are situated. Do presentations about your cafe at provider meetings, attend workshops to learn about the other client population, and finally be flexible about meeting times and locations when you're building up your network with providers who work in a different service system. And here we have Tai Chi at the Middleborough Memory Cafe. Tip number 2, break down professional silos. Keep communication open and honest. Discuss together any issues that come up with guests from either population. Don't assume that staff are familiar with the philosophy and operations of a memory cafe. It's a great idea to have maybe an FAQ sheet, frequently asked questions, that just explains the purpose and philosophy and the activities that will take place in a memory cafe. Find out how to get the information directly to case managers who will actually be bringing IDD clients to the cafe. So these are the folks who you really want to know this basic information about cafes. And here's a quote from our survey. Educate yourself on the client group you are least familiar with. Touch base with caregiver support staff during icebreaker activities or while enjoying refreshments, and talk about what types of activities each guest enjoys. Build a positive relationship with those you are collaborating with and communicate on how they can be most helpful to you. For example, group management, activity ideas, distributing supplies, etc. So really the point here is communicate openly and proactively with providers who you may not have worked with before. These photos are from the Topsfield Memory Cafe, which is really special because in the warm months it is held in an accessible garden called Rest Stop Ranch. So it provides an opportunity to enjoy the scent of flowers and the sun on one's face. What a gift. And I think this is just an example of how creative and unique each memory cafe is. Tip number 3, be aware of staffing challenges. We had mentioned this earlier in the webinar that individuals with IDD do not always have staff to bring them, and 4 of 9 survey respondents reported that they have run across this situation. It's important to make sure that IDD providers understand how the cafe works and that they do send a sufficient number of staff to accompany the guests who will be attending. However, Cafes should not rigidly require one-to-one staffing. Some guests with IDD do fine with a lower ratio, and flexibility on this is going to make it more possible for guests with IDD to come enjoy the memory cafe. And again, this comes back to establishing really open and clear communication between service providers so that you can make sure everyone understands what the cafe is about, what kind of skills will be needed, and that staffing is appropriate to the particular individuals who attend. And here is the Topsfield Memory Cafe's indoor space at Trinity Church during the winter months. Tip number 4, expect family and friends. Memory cafes are for people living with dementia, and they are also for family, friends, and caregivers. As mentioned before, other group home residents and day program participants with IDD are likely to come along, and this is in keeping with the memory cafe philosophy. And you won't always know who has dementia and who doesn't, also in keeping with the memory cafe philosophy. However, one caveat to bear in mind, younger participants with IDD may have an energy level that is a little bit harder for the older participants. This is a comment that one of the IDD-Inclusive Cafe coordinators raised. So it's not something that comes up a lot, but it did come up once. And in this case, she talked with the IDD providers whom she partnered with, and they kind of revisited what the energy level and the style and the goals of the cafe are. And the IDD providers were a little more selective in who they brought along the next time, just to make the environment safe and comfortable for everybody. And I want to just take a moment and mention what I consider to be the 2 golden rules of running a memory cafe. 1, that those who need personal care assistance must bring a care partner. And 2, that groups must contact you in advance to discuss whether attendance would be appropriate and what the staffing needs are. So as long as you make these 2 rules clear on your flyer and all your other outreach materials, then you can throw the doors open and be inclusive, and you should be able to be prepared for the needs of those who attend. While we're on the theme of family and friends, I want to revisit the point that care partners have different experiences. So general population caregivers do not have similar experiences to paid caregivers. There are differences for the individuals with dementia as well. The lives that general population individuals and IDD individuals have lived are often very different, and finding common ground in their memories is sometimes a challenge. And this cafe coordinator said, we choose to focus on creating new experiences whenever possible, and often catch those moments in a photo that the person can take with them. So that's a really nice way to find common ground among participants who may have had different experiences. Regarding care partners, memory cafes, while they're not support groups, they are supportive, and they are places that care partners often find others who are in a similar situation and make important connections. So I find that as my cafe becomes more and more inclusive, I sometimes will put on my matchmaker hat, and I might think, you know, this adult daughter and this adult daughter who are sitting across the room from one another may want to know each other, and I'll make a point of introducing them. So, you know, I think there are ways that cafe coordinators can both broaden the tent and also be conscious of the specific and individual needs that some of our participants may have. Tip number 5, choose activities wisely. So again, we're looking for ways to bring these populations together. And one theme that came up in the surveys is that music is wonderful. Music is the magic. Music is a universal and unifying activity that encourages participation by everyone. Another quote is, we have tried many activities with games, music, and art. A favorite is having a guest artist through our local arts museum lead us in an art project. She is amazing, and every single person is made to feel like an artist. There are not barriers. We also did a session with Drums Alive, which is a particular art facilitator, and all enjoyed it on some level. So I appreciate this quote because this shows that it's not always the specific activity, it's how it's facilitated. And I have certainly had this experience in my memory cafe as well. There are facilitators who are just so inclusive and enthusiastic and warm and good at communicating in a way that is multisensory and appropriate for different cognitive needs, and really they could do anything and people would love it. That said, the next quote is, "We've had to steer away from activities with a more intellectual feel that our general population guests might enjoy because they don't work with our guests with IDD." So, there may be activities where they're so focused on a particular prior experience or knowledge base that you may want to avoid them. And finally, aim for no-fail activities. And I think that that is important for every memory cafe. And now I'm going to say, aside from all these tips, be willing to experiment. I think part of what's wonderful about the memory cafe model is you can do different things on different cafe sessions and see what works. I myself am surprised again and again. And here is the Topsfield Memory Cafe, which gave its guests a really fun and creative challenge, which is, let's figure out how to communicate without words. So this was a fun, no-cost activity that was wonderful for all of their participants. Tip number 6, set up the room for success. So you want to promote mingling, especially bearing in mind that some people will be coming in groups and it's a little harder to get people to mingle when they're part of a group. A circle of chairs promotes mingling better than small tables. Also, refreshments can be a challenge. This can be true for any guests. So if you find that you have guests who are having trouble limiting the amount of food that they take, you can cover the refreshments and only offer them at the end. Or you can have volunteers serve refreshments to guests. And while we're talking about volunteers, volunteers are great and they can help promote mingling and manage issues that arise. I tell the volunteers at our cafe that it's like hosting a party. So that's what they come in planning to do. And it is wonderful to have many hosts at our party. Tip number 7, model inclusion for guests. Here are 2 wonderful quotes that say it all. "It is important to have one's words and actions always reflect how we best respect and support each other, whether it is pertaining to a disability or to the challenges that people face regarding living with dementia. We always strive to keep a positive, sensitive, and respectful environment for all that attend the Memory Cafe. When we see the need to help educate about disability, we do it in a learning manner by exhibiting appropriate behaviors." And I think that's a wonderful aspect of memory cafes, is they're not a lecture, they're not didactic, but they are a place that care partners and guests have modeled for them ways to make life work and be enjoyable in the context of cognitive challenges and differences. Here you have more scenes of Tai Chi at the Middleborough Memory Cafe. And finally, tip number 8, be prepared. Be sure you have an understanding about what to do in an emergency and who is responsible for the participants at the cafe. So whenever you're bringing different providers together who haven't worked together, you just want to be clear about roles. Make sure to get RSVPs to the extent possible. So actually some cafes are drop-ins, some require RSVPs, some request RSVPs. We all know the nature of dementia means that even if someone RSVPs, it may not be a good day, they may not be able to make it for someone else. They may need to be spontaneous and come when they didn't plan on it. But if you're having groups attend, you really want good solid RSVPs and to make sure that you have sufficient staff attending with that group of individuals. And again, it's important that those staff have a basic understanding of memory cafes, what they're for, their guiding philosophy, and what will be taking place during the cafe. As we're moving toward the conclusion of this webinar, here are guests at the Topsfield Memory Cafe reminding us that it's good to stretch ourselves. As you've seen, the IDD inclusive cafes can work, and they have many benefits. Cafe coordinators will tell you that it is worth the effort. It's also a reality that effort and staff time has expense, and so I tip my hat to the Massachusetts Department of Developmental Services for recognizing this and providing ongoing funding support to the cafes, which certainly helps make it possible for them to provide the additional staff time to really make these inclusive cafes feasible. I'm going to show you one more slide now, which to me is hopeful, because it shows that in general the cafes started out with many challenges that have eased through experience and collaboration. So the final theme here is progress. We asked cafe coordinators if they had a variety of challenges and then if they had made progress on those challenges and how. And it was great to see that most respondents have seen progress in reducing stigma or prejudice toward guests with IDD, and in helping guests to accept the behaviors of other guests, and all have made progress in finding mutually enjoyable activities. So the message here is make a start and it will get easier. We live in an aging society. We live in a society where people with IDD are living longer. The needs that inclusive memory cafes address are not going to go away. They are going to grow. So it's really encouraging to see progress at the inclusive memory cafes. I hope that those of you who are watching will take inspiration to make your memory cafe and perhaps your other programs more inclusive of people with IDD and also whomever else are the people in your neighborhood. Here are some resources that you may find useful. The Percolator offers a free Memory Cafe toolkit in English and Spanish. You can watch one of the training sessions that I led in 2016 for providers who were interested in applying to run an inclusive Memory Cafe. And finally, the Wisconsin Memory Cafe Best Practices Guide is excellent. Wisconsin is a national leader in the Memory Cafe movement, and their state government has done a lot of work in the area of dementia and IDD. So this resource guide is a good place to start looking. Please feel free to contact me for more information about anything you've seen in this webinar. You can also visit the Percolator at these links that you see. The Memory Cafe directory lists all the memory cafes in Massachusetts, and it also has a link towards the top to a 1-minute video in English and Spanish, which shows what a memory cafe is all about and has footage from 3 of our state's memory cafes. So this is a good resource to show providers and potential guests, family members, etc., who might want to know what a memory cafe is all about. Thank you very much for watching this webinar and for your interest in IDD inclusive memory cafes, and have a good day.